This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm trying to get better at understanding and participating in the conversation that a lot of people are having about the theology of work. So on this podcast, I am reading through and reflecting on a bunch of books on the theology of work, what I like, what I don't like, what I'm still thinking about. I am in the process of writing my own book on the theology of work, and this is an opportunity for me to think out loud about what other people have said on that topic. I started this conversation in episode 37 by naming some of the things that every book on the theology of work says. That was partly so I wouldn't have to say the same things on every episode about every book, and partly because it helps me get my bearings and make sure that I'm really paying attention to the conversation as a whole. Then, in episode 38, I reflected on a few high points from Tim Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, which is awesome, which you should buy and you should read. And now in this episode, I'm taking on another one of the big players in this conversation, though it's a rather different kind of book from Keller's. It's by John Mark Comer, and it is called Garden City, Work, Rest, and the Art of Being Human. And I want to start my first reflection on this book. This is on pages 59 and 60. He's reading through Genesis 2, and he comes to the part where it says that a river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there, it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. And then there's this parenthetical statement, the gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. And Comer rightfully notices that he and probably a lot of other people have a tendency to just skip that part. Let's talk about Adam and Eve being created out of the dust of the earth. Let's talk about man and woman becoming one flesh. Let's talk about the creation of Eve. And he says, I love that parenthetic line, the gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. And I'm quoting Comer, I used to read that and think, who cares? But I think I see what it's getting at now. The author is saying that Eden is made up of raw materials. It's spilling over with pent-up potentiality. Everything you need to make a civilization is there. All you have to do is cultivate it, to draw it out. But that's going to take some work. And then Comer actually quotes Tim Keller's definition of work. I didn't mention this in the last episode. I probably should have, but Keller defines work this way. Work is rearranging the raw material of God's creation in such a way that it helps the world in general and people in particular thrive and flourish. I have my own version of that definition. I just define work as improving creation, but I think the point is the same. Comer goes on to say this rhythm of rearranging that raw material, as Keller put it, is found in all sorts of work. When a farmer takes soil and seed and rearranges it into a crop teeming with food. When a builder takes a tree and a rock and rearranges it into a home. When a fashion designer takes fabric and metal and rearranges it into something with shape and beauty and functionality. When a musician takes a sound and a tone and a melody and rearranges it into something coherent and mesmerizing, and so on and so forth. He says all this is the work of cultivation, which is drawing out something's potential. Good culture, he says, is the result of even better people hard at work rearranging the raw stuff of planet Earth into a place of delight. There's a lot there. What strikes me, what I really appreciate, and I did mention this in the last episode in talking about Keller's book, but the recognition that our job from day one, the image-bearing work that we were created to do, the vocation, to use another term that's popular in this conversation, the vocation that God gave us from the beginning is to do things with his creation, in effect, to change his creation, to make it something better. And that's not at all an indication that God didn't get it right the first time, or that God did the best he could and now we have to pick up the slack, or that God made a mistake that we are trying to overcome. Not at all. It simply means that creation was the beginning of a movement, not the totality of it. God created a world that was dynamic by nature, that would have what Comer calls raw materials, things that are available to be used for other purposes, to create, to build, to design, to shape new things, additional new things that weren't there before, what some in this conversation would call co-creation with God. That is our job. That's what God put us here to do. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, this is page 73. Comer is talking about this idea of vocation, or what some people will name as calling, and saying, well, okay, if we are created to work, we are created to fulfill this vocation, this calling, how do I figure out my specific component of that? Which particular work am I supposed to do? And Comer says this, I really like this. He says, I honestly think that we're more likely to figure out our calling from a 4-letter Myers-Briggs label than we are from a burning bush. So Moses gets his calling from a burning bush. We often wish we could have the same sort of experience. And Comer says, yeah, that's probably not going to happen. In the vast majority of cases, for the vast majority of people, God is not going to audibly speak from a bush or a cloud or through a donkey or whatever to tell us exactly what we're supposed to do or not do with our lives. In fact, God has given us this tremendous set of other resources. If you're familiar with Comer, you know he's not going to use lots of technical terms, theological terms, and that sort of thing, which is fine. But the technical term for this one is general revelation, meaning God has revealed certain very specific things through his word and through his son. And we often call those special revelation. But he's also revealed an awful lot of things to us about himself, about ourselves, and about the world we live in through everything else. The creation itself tells us about God. God's attributes are on display, Romans says. And then in addition, he gives us the ability to learn and discover and see who God is and who we are meant to be from the world around us. And so something like a personality assessment. And I know there are all sorts of reasons to be skeptical in the face of people who overuse or misuse or abuse personality assessments. But Comer's point, I think, is right. God has put enormously helpful resources at our disposal to figure out who we are and who we are meant to be in the world. And things like personality assessments can play a very helpful role in that process. Jumping forward a ways, this is page 107. This is something I didn't mention back in episode 37 about things that are in every Theology of Work book. This is one that's in a lot of them. The language of the creation mandate or the cultural mandate in relation to the Great Commission. And so Theology of Work literature often says, hey, there is this thing we call the Great Commission, go into all the world, preach the gospel, make disciples, baptize, et cetera, et cetera. And that is obviously a fundamental component of Christian existence in the world. But these books will say, don't forget that there is also this thing we call the cultural mandate, which is to work, to produce, to flourish, to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and so forth. And that mandate has not gone away. And so Comer says, page 107, he says it this way: followers of Jesus have a dual vocation, not one, but two callings. The original calling to rule over the earth, to make culture, and a new calling to make disciples. And I really like this sentence: to help people come back into relationship with the Creator so that they can rule over the creation. In other words, part of why we invite people into the Great Commission is precisely to fulfill the cultural mandate. Not just so that they can get, I'm quoting Comer again here, not just so that they can get forgiveness and go to heaven when they die, but so that they can come back from heaven and rule over the earth as they were always supposed to. This is an issue I'll name as one that I'm still working through. What exactly is the relationship between our original calling as humans to fill the earth and subdue it, to rule over the works of God's hands, and the Great Commission mandate to go and make disciples of all nations? I think there's a lot more to be said about the connection between them. And I appreciated in this context Comer bringing that up and trying to integrate the two in a helpful way. Page 148. This is a sort of irony. I mentioned back in episode 37 that a lot of books on the theology of work are big on the virtue of quality. So most books, all books maybe on this topic, will say there is something inherently good about doing your work well before we've had a conversation about doing work so that we can share Jesus with our coworkers and these sorts of things. There's already a God-honoring goodness in being good at our work. And the verse that is regularly quoted in this context comes from Proverbs. Do you see someone skilled in their work? They will serve before kings. They will not serve before officials of low rank. Now, here's what's ironic. So Comer quotes that verse, and then he says, when you're good at what you do, you end up in front of kings. Then he says, it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus' work was superlative. After all, he's the embodiment of the Creator God. Look around you. Creation is incredible. God doesn't do cheap, low-grade, half-baked work. He's not lazy. He doesn't make junk. Now, here's what strikes me is, on the one hand, true, extremely true. God does not make junk. He is not lazy. He does not do cheap, low-grade, half-baked work. Could not agree more with that. But the irony was when he started that paragraph by mentioning the superlativeness of Jesus's work right after talking about how you end up in front of kings, because Jesus did end up in front of kings. And it was not because they were impressed with his craftsmanship. In fact, Jesus ended up in front of kings because they hated him and they mocked him. And eventually those particular kings and governors and rulers and people in places of high rank put him to death. And so there's a little bit of an irony there. And I don't say that to disagree necessarily with what Comer is saying, but more to say, let's expand this out into a broader issue in relation to the theology of work, because the theology of work movement absolutely loves Proverbs, because Proverbs is where we get things like, if you work hard, you will succeed. And if you do not work hard, you will not succeed. And all sorts of diatribes against laziness and affirmations of diligence. And so the Proverbs is fertile ground for the theology of work. The problem comes, and I'm not saying Comer did this, but some books do. The problem is when conversations about the theology of work treat Proverbs as a set of absolute promises. If you work hard, you will always succeed. That's not what Proverbs is. I mean, I hope that's not what Proverbs is, because if that's what Proverbs is, then Proverbs is lying to us, because it is simply not always the case that if you work hard, you will succeed. Sometimes you work hard and it doesn't work out. Sometimes you are diligent and you still fail. Sometimes you do everything Dave Ramsey ever told you to do with your money and you're still broke. Not because Proverbs is false, but because the world is broken and the world is under the dominion of sin. And the book of Proverbs is not meant to say this is how things will always be at all times and all places without exception. The book of Proverbs is meant to say this is how the world generally works. Thanks be to God. And sometimes it doesn't. But in general, if you are diligent, you will do better than if you are not. Now, to bring that all back to Comer's line about Jesus, you would think that Jesus, by the time he turned 30, would have been a world-renowned craftsman. If he fully embodied all the goodness of humanity, if he did his craft the best that anyone ever would do, he should have ended up serving as a carpenter or a stonemason, whatever he was exactly, before kings. And it didn't happen. And we certainly have no evidence that it happened. So I caution the use of this idea that quality is a virtue unto itself, because that is true. God is honored by quality work more than lesser quality work. That is true. But it is not the case that life in this world as it currently exists will simply work out for you, provided that you work hard. It is simply not that simple. Going back to Genesis a little bit, so this is page 158. This is simply an observation that Comer makes that I find helpful in expanding out what's happening in Genesis. So in Genesis 1 and 2, Adam and Eve are given the task to rule over the rest of creation, particularly the beasts of the field, the fish in the sea, and so forth. And so Comer points out that the serpent in Genesis 3 is now exercising a sort of manipulative authority over them instead. So he says it this way, remember, quote, Adam and Eve were called to rule over every living creature that moves on the ground. But instead, in a catastrophic inversion of the created order, an animal that Adam himself named ruled over them. This is the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen. The interesting point to me in that is Genesis 3 names some fairly specific things that go wrong, but it also paints a broad picture of God set the world up to work a certain way. Sin is not just a, let's say, slight departure from that, a minor little deviation here and there. Sin is a reversal of God's good order. Sin is me submitting myself when I should have been in authority. And I don't mean in a lording it over others. I mean in a, I am going to let what is evil dictate what is right. And that is not the way it's supposed to be. So I appreciate him pointing out to us that the position of the snake lording it over Adam and Eve is exactly the opposite of what was supposed to happen. Jumping ahead a little bit, page 169. I've mentioned in past episodes that Ecclesiastes is always a big part of these conversations. I also mentioned a moment ago that I think maybe Comer has not quite reckoned with what Proverbs is and is not saying. At least some books in this area have not. So he names what's going on in Ecclesiastes and then reads a point where the author of Ecclesiastes says, everything is meaningless. Everything's a waste of time. I despair of it all. What a waste. It's all meaningless. And he says, keep in mind, this is Comer speaking, that this is a picture of work under the sun. This is what our work looks like if we do it apart from God. Hopefully, our entire outlook on work is drastically different. So he's saying the perspective of Ecclesiastes, what the author has done there is said, this is how it will feel when you do your work without reference to God. It will be meaningless. And Comer says we should have the opposite perspective. We should look at our work as something we do with God. And I appreciate that. There's something very good about that. My concern there perhaps is Ecclesiastes is not simply this is what the world looks like when any given individual works without reference to God. Ecclesiastes is also this is what the world looks like because the world operates in some sense apart from God. It isn't just the mindset of the worker. It is the reality of the world under the dominion of sin. So when he says this idea that work is meaningless is only true if we're working apart from God, well, the plain fact of it is a lot of work is meaningless. A lot of work is troublesome. A lot of work is, as Ecclesiastes calls it, a great misfortune. And when the author of Ecclesiastes says, what do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. He's not simply saying it will feel that way if you don't take God into account. It is that way. There is a great deal of work going on that is in fact meaningless. There are forest fires that destroy things and there's nothing left. There are floods that take everything away and there's nothing left. There is war. There is sin. Reality bites. And one of the trends that I have seen in the books that I've read on the theology of work is sometimes there's just a little bit too much optimism there. And there are a couple of books coming in the next few episodes that are going to make that point and do it better than I have so far. So this is a conversation I'm going to come back to. For now, I simply want to point out Ecclesiastes is more than just how it feels when we bracket God out of the equation. It is how it is for real in many instances. And yet, thanks be to God, there is more than that. Moving ahead, Sabbath. Comer's got, I mentioned this, a lot of books on work do say some things about Sabbath, some more than others. Comer's got some great stuff on Sabbath here in this book and other books as well. The particular thing he mentioned in Genesis that I wanted to bring up here is the idea of blessing. So Genesis 1 is really just a few words repeated over and over. God said it was good, and then he moved on to the next day. But then there's this word blessing. God blesses the creatures, God blesses humanity, and then it says he blessed the seventh day. And Comer asks the question, how do you bless a day? What does that mean? And the idea of blessing in Genesis 1 and 2 is something like a commissioning. So God makes a thing, he looks at the thing and sees that it is good, which means it is in fact capable of doing what he designed it to do. And then he blesses it, which means go do the thing I designed you to do. Go have fun with that. And so to bless a day, Comer says, the Sabbath, the day, has a life-giving ability to procreate, to fill up the world with life. No matter how much you love your job or fine-tune your work-life balance, by the end of the week, you're tired. Your fuel cells are empty, but rest refills us with energy, creativity, vision, strength, optimism, buoyancy, clarity, and hope. Rest is life-giving because God blessed the Sabbath day. So when I think about entering into a time of rest, it is not simply ceasing to do something. It is rather that the day is going to do something to us. And I found that extremely helpful. Moving ahead, page 207. So the context, I'll say for myself, being in the, let's say, creative business, entrepreneurship spaces for the last several years, listening to podcasts, reading books, following influencers, all the things, there is a given in those spaces, often in Christian spaces as well as non-Christian spaces particularly, that more is better. If you're not growing, you're dying. Things are dynamic, things are not static, so either you're moving forward or you're moving backward, and so more. And Comer comes to the conversation between Pharaoh, well, not between Pharaoh and Moses. Moses and Aaron have come to Pharaoh and, let my people go and all that, and Pharaoh goes back to the slave drivers and says, more. And he says, this is quoting Comer here on page 207, Pharaoh is implacable and relentless. This quasi-divine image of the sun god Re is a tyrant, ruthless and cruel. No matter how much you produce, it's never enough. You live under the ominous shadow of the daily quota, more. There is a difficult tension here because it is true. If you run a business, if you're not growing, you're dying. Businesses never stay in one place. There's no such thing as a static scenario. It is dynamic. Things are changing. You have to move, and that's all true. On the other hand, I wonder how many business owners, how many nonprofits, how many schools, how many ministries, how many churches stop and say, are we pursuing more for its own sake? Are we just trying to get bigger because we think that bigger simply is better? Do we think that we necessarily do the good work that God has for us only if we get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger? And because that requires then each particular component of a business or a nonprofit, of a ministry, of a church, whatever, of a school, for each person to say more. Whatever the quota was last year, let's do more. Whatever the bar was last year, let's go higher. And I appreciate Comer coming along and saying, wait a second, is more always better? And he doesn't go into the particulars of how that would play out in the business sector, the nonprofit sector, but I do think there's a valid question there. When do you look at the numbers of your work and say, actually, that's enough. We don't need to get bigger. But how do we not die at that point, the practical side of it? So it's a good question. I don't know that I have all the answers, but I enjoy the question quite a bit. Page 253. I'll probably say this every episode. All literature on the theology of work names 4 parts to the story: the original goodness of work, the corruption of work in the fall, the redemption of work in Christ, and the eternal restoration of work in the eschaton. And Comer says really well a couple of things, particularly related to that last part of the story. He says it this way: our eschatology shapes our ethics. all this talk about the future has massive implications for how we work and rest in the here and now. And I'm going to need a few episodes on this, I think, a little later, because there is so much going on in the theology of work literature about what eternity looks like. The basic observation being there is work. There is a material world that we will steward in eternity that will never stop. There will always be work to do. And that's pretty straightforward across the board in all this literature. Where it gets complicated is more about how does the work we do now relate to the good work that we will do in eternity? What's the connection between them? And Comer says something helpful here, because there are some books that I'll come to later that I think overplay their hand on this. But Comer says this. He says it needs to be said, this is page 257, it needs to be said that good work is worthwhile, even if it's just for this age, with no bearing on the age to come at all. Some other books that I'll come to in other episodes are going to ground the goodness of work now in the idea that that specific work will last into eternity. And that's another conversation, but I think Comer has done something helpful by saying, hey, look, there is good work that won't last. That's okay. It doesn't have to make it into eternity to be good work. So appreciate that. On the other hand, then he does say, this is on page 260, he says, some of the good work we do will actually last into God's good world. Now, I don't know about that. I'm thinking about that. Let me read another paragraph. He says, I am saying that when I envision the future, meaning eternity, I imagine living in a home. My guess is that it will have a rug or two. I imagine eating Thai food and drinking an almond milk latte and listening to Prelude from Suite Number 1 in G major on a cello and riding a bicycle and flying in an airplane and reveling in all the good, beautiful, and true things that image bearers have come up with over the millennia of human history. I don't know. I don't know if an almond milk latte is what's going to make the cut. Yeah, that's what I'm going to have to come back to a little bit. I'll say maybe this much for now. The idea that everything in this material world burns up and goes away and we just simply become disembodied spirits floating in clouds in heaven is absolutely false. 100%, unequivocally, no caveats, false. So the idea that material reality is part of eternity is 100% biblical. I think where I get nervous is when we start naming specific cultural realities in this life as, oh, that one is so good, it's going to make the cut. That one is so in line with God's intent for creation that it will last in eternity. That specific thing. I get pretty nervous about being specific on that. But that's a conversation that I'll come back to. There are other books that will take us more deeply into that topic. Backing up a little bit, page 255, there is a great deal in this conversation that needs saying about the difference between a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset. And that has to do with money, that has to do with skills and talents, it has to do with time, lots of things. And that's going to get integrated as I go along into conversations about what it means to be God and what it means to be a creature. Because on the one hand, we are creatures. So when we think in terms of scarcity, it's because in part we are finite. You and I do have a scarcity in and of ourselves because we're humans, we're not God. And yet at the same time, being image bearers, being given the life of God for eternity means there is an abundance there. And so we do not need to hoard. We do not need to grasp selfishly onto things for fear that we will not have enough for ourselves. There's a bent towards generosity. So there's a big, difficult conversation in there. But this bit struck me. This is page 255. He talks about the idea that you only live once. Time is this limited, precious commodity, and you got to do what you can because you only get one crack at this. And he says, no. Not if you're a follower of Jesus. We have all eternity to live into God's world. We'll live another day, another week, another millennium. Yes, time is a precious commodity, but we are filthy rich. We have plenty of it. And so in this context, he says, every Sabbath we can rest, really, fully, honestly rest. The world's not going anywhere. Again, a lot of things for me to think about, what scarcity and abundance mean, what being finite creatures means compared to being God. But he makes a good point. There are lots of things that I will never get around to doing in this life, and that's okay, because time is not actually a scarce commodity for me. I have all eternity. The last thing I want to point out, this is page 282. It has to do with work and envy. Jesus' disciples, John in particular, are not happy with a guy who is driving out demons in Jesus' name. And so John says, this is page 281, he's quoting, "Teacher," he says to Jesus, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he wasn't one of us." See? They see some guy driving out demons, we're quoting Comer here, which I think we could all agree is a good thing, and they're jealous, insecure, posturing, and manipulative, trying to shut his little exorcism startup down. But then Comer says, ironically, the story right before this one is about how the disciples were supposed to cast out a demon, but they couldn't do it. So the disciples are supposed to do a job and can't, and then they get mad when somebody else can. And Comer says the root of this is what the writers of the Bible call envy. Envy is when you covet another person's story. What greed is to money, envy is to life as a whole. It's when you look at a coworker or a sibling or friend from college or celebrity and think, I want that life. To live out of a scarcity mindset is to believe that I've got to get what I can, and I'm offended, I'm hurt, I'm angered when somebody has a thing or a resource or an opportunity or whatever, a life that I don't have. That's a mindset that says, I do not trust God to give me the good work that he has for me, and to give me the good rest that he has for me, and to sustain my life for eternity so I have all the time I could possibly need to do all the things that he has for me to do. That's about all there is to say about that. Again, the book is Garden City by John Mark Comer. It's good. You should read it. There's a lot of valuable stuff in it beyond what I've talked about in this episode. There is an Amazon link in the show notes to purchase it if you are so inclined. Get the book, read the book, do what it says, and you will get better at your work. And until next time, thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this endeavor is Ben Kibbe, CEO of Kibbe Consulting in Columbiana, Ohio. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Steve Kearns, and music is provided by Dave Murray of Deradoon Guitars. If this podcast has been useful or challenging to you, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. If you think it might be useful or challenging to anyone else, well, you know what to do. Ultimately, we hope that listening to this podcast has helped you get better at making things good and good at making things better.